Hi, everyone, and a very warm welcome to Templeton World Charity Foundation's third webinar on the topic of human flourishing. My name is Bonnie Zahl, and I am an external advisor for Templeton World Charity Foundation. Today, I'll be moderating the webinar, which is the third of a series that explores various challenges and opportunities related to advancing the science of human flourishing. In today's webinar, we'll be exploring a few different questions. How do we think about human flourishing for people who live in challenging circumstances? How do we relate flourishing to experiences of suffering and adversity? Do we need to expand our conceptualization of flourishing, of what a good life looks like and how we can pursue it, so that it can encompass the volume and richness of experiences that people might have in their individual lifetimes, and the diversity of experiences that we see people of different contexts and around the world? Joining me for today's discussion are some recent TWCF awardees who have received initial funding to pursue research through the Grand Challenges in Human Flourishing initiative. And it is my pleasure to welcome Dr. David Addiss, Professor Deborah Carr, and Professor Shigehiro Oishi. David is the director of founder of the Focus Area for Compassion and Ethics at the Task Force for Global Health, where he is spearheading efforts to bring compassion and ethical action to the center of global health work through research, consultation, convenings, and education for healthcare practitioners around the world. Deborah Carr is the professor of sociology at Boston University and the inaugural director of the Center of Innovation in Social Science. She is a life course sociologist who has done extensive research on aging, death, and dying, bereavement, family relationships over the life course, and the stigma associated with health conditions, including obesity and disability. Shigehiro Oishi is the professor of psychology at the University of Virginia. He conducts research in the relationship between personality, culture, social ecology, and well-being, and he's particularly interested in using experimental and quasi-experimental methodologies to examine the causes and consequences of well-being. He's interested in exploring how culture and people's environments interact with dispositional factors to influence subjective sense of well-being and sense of meaning in life. Thank you for being with us today. So I'm going to jump in with some questions for you. For the Grand Challenges in Human Flourishing, each of you submitted an idea or a concept that point to the need for us to develop richer accounts of what it means to flourish, especially as it relates to the reality of people's experiences in life. Aristotle wrote extensively about the concept of eudaimonia, which translates roughly to what we now think of as living the good life. Contemporary Scottish-American philosopher Alistair MacIntyre defines the good life as doing well, faring well, and behaving well. And in this, he means that a flourishing life is one that is morally good, subjectively happy, and socially outstanding, and that these three are balanced and synchronized through making wise choices about how one lives their life, which sounds like a really tall order for a lot of people around the world right now who are trying to keep their head above water through a global public health crisis, who might be living with chronic illnesses or other physical or cognitive challenges, or living in environments where their personal freedoms and choices are severely constrained. So in light of these realities, do we need richer accounts of what it means to flourish, especially in the face of adversity? And if so, what might these accounts look like? And how should we think about flourishing? Can each of you tell us a little more about the research that you and your colleagues will be pursuing along these lines? David, over to you.
Thank you very much, Bonnie, and thanks for that really challenging question. I do think we need richer accounts of flourishing, particularly with the COVID-19 pandemic. Very few of us, I think, would say that we're flourishing currently. So we tend to think of flourishing as somehow in tension with or opposite of adversity or suffering, something like doing well in all domains of life. And as you pointed out, what does this mean for us mere mortals who are struggling with day-to-day challenges, not to mention those of us who are suffering in more overt ways? We know that some people who seem to have it all are not flourishing, and others who might be on their deathbeds have a sense of flourishing. So these things don't always match up, and we're very interested in understanding what flourishing means in the context of suffering and adversity, particularly given the prevalence of adversity in our world today. I'm a public health physician, and so we're very practical in public health. And we're very interested in the suffering that prompts people to seek healthcare. Our hypothesis is that compassion, this awareness of suffering, the desire to alleviate suffering, truly seeing the person who is experiencing suffering, holds the key to flourishing, particularly in the context of healthcare. Now, we don't think of healthcare systems as places of flourishing very often, and the healthcare system is really challenged at the moment. But we think that compassion has a key role to play, and so we're going to be examining the conceptual issues at these points of intersection of suffering, compassion, and flourishing. We want to make sure that our metrics are solid and that they're valid across different cultures, both for compassion and for flourishing. And we'll be working with colleagues in different parts of the world, particularly healthcare systems that are exemplars, where compassion seems to flourish and where the patients also seem to flourish, as well as the healthcare staff. So that's our general approach to this question. Thank you.
Over to you, Debbie.
Great. Well, thank you for hosting this webinar, and thank you for your support of our work. And like David, I do think we need to rethink what flourishing is. Is it possible for all, and what does it look like? Because at one level, flourishing is easy for those who have had lives of advantage, right? Those who have had every support, who actually have the privilege of choice of being able to choose well. And one of the kind of motivating aspects of our study is this question: is it possible to flourish for people who have experienced extreme adversity, whether physical, such as chronic illness, or economic, those who are living in deep poverty, or even social, those who are not socially integrated, who do not have deep social ties that provide them the foundation from which to flourish. And so what we're thinking of doing is first kind of interrogating the concept of flourishing. Is it multidimensional? Are there some dimensions that people can achieve even if they haven't had supports, as opposed to those who have? And then what does it look like for different sub-communities that maybe have not had advantages? So we're interested in first looking at existing data sets to figure out, when we identify subpopulations, such as those living in poverty, those who have extreme levels of physical health problems, or those who are living alone with no friends or family, what are the dimensions of flourishing? Is it happiness? Is it spirituality? Is it social connectedness? And really trying to understand those subdimensions. But then also, more importantly, digging deeply into communities that maybe have been left out of mainstream data collection projects: incarcerated individuals, refugees, those who are in the criminal justice system, for instance, and hearing in their own words, what does flourishing mean to you? How might we achieve it? And one of our goals is to figure out, does flourishing only come from within, or does it come from social networks? Does it come from community partners, or even social programs that provide an economic or social foundation from which individuals can flourish? So I think it's a really fascinating area of work. And I think, like the foundation, many of us believe that flourishing is indeed within the reach of all. And our job as researchers is to figure out ways to identify those sites from which we can facilitate flourishing.
Thank you, Bonnie, for setting the tone. I really think that doing well, faring well, and behaving well really captures what good life is. But as you said, and as David and Deborah already said, this is a really tall order for many of us. And the research in psychology over the last 10 years, 20 years clearly show, on average, wealthy individuals report having a happy life and meaningful life. And these are the people who have stable financial resources, stable close relationships, and influential jobs. And they get to feel like their lives are meaningful and happy. obviously we ask the question, what about the rest of us who are not as fortunate? And, David mentioned the healthcare system. Deborah mentioned, prisons. My sort of the starting point is the victims of natural disasters. I grew up in Japan, so I witnessed a lot of natural disasters, as you know, the typhoons and earthquakes. And if you think about those people who lost their house, lost a loved one, how could they feel they are happy and their life are meaningful, at least in the short term? It is very difficult. I spent 1 year in sabbatical in Kobe back in 2013 and 14. And indeed, 16 years after the earthquake, the people who lost their homes were still less happy than those Kobe residents who did not lose their home. But so, people say time heals everything, but in the case of the survivors of the great earthquake, time did not heal all wounds. But what was amazing when I was there was that, children who experienced earthquake, the video, TV interviews from back in '95, clearly show some children are really interested in becoming nurse, firefighters, and things like that. And I mean, clearly, that experience changed people. So we looked at the job application data, the hard data, and found that actually in Kobe area from 1995, the people are much more likely to apply for a job, such as nurses and social workers and kindergarten teacher, firefighters. And you don't see that kind of pattern in Tokyo area. So what we realized was that if you use the traditional metrics of happiness and meaning, you're not really capturing these people's sort of the turn in change in perspective in life and value of caring and compassion that David talked about. So that's why we wanted to sort of create some new way to think about this good life. And what we came up with is this concept of psychologically rich life, diverse, difficult, experiences, but that result in some perspective changes. So with this grant, we're exploring this concept of psychologically rich life in challenging places, such as those who live in a slum of Manila, and also a small scale societies, such as Igbo of Nigeria, and the Mauritius, and the Tuva of Russia, which borders Mongolia. So we're just exploring whether those people who are not fortunate to have stable financial resources or stable interpersonal relationship could still thrive and flourish with the limited material resources.
Thank you, Shige. It's very interesting that you mentioned meaning. It's reminded me of Viktor Frankl's, a quote from one of his books where he says, "Life is never made unbearable by circumstances, but only by lack of meaning and purpose." And I was wondering, and that strikes me as what a lot of people think about when they think of suffering, the ability to turn that experience into something meaningful that motivates one to move forward. That might be seen as a sort of indicator of a person who's striving for change and striving for growth. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on, you are all working with very diverse populations and subpopulations, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on meaning and suffering, and how that relates to the kinds of questions that you're asking, both in terms of how that relates to the individual's own understanding, but also to, Debbie, you were talking about the community aspect of that. Trying to figure out who's going to go first. Let's go backwards. Debbie, would you like to start?
Great. I think that's a great question. And I absolutely think that people who have experienced adversity may indeed experience kind of growth in meaning. And there's so many ways that we might think about this happening, and ways that we can interrogate the people participating in our studies to figure out what are they doing. So for instance, we often know that when someone has experienced some kind of trauma, they try to figure out ways to help other people who have experienced that trauma, or to figure out ways to ensure that it doesn't befall other individuals. So I think that's something that's really exciting that we might find. And again, shifting the lens at some level, oftentimes when people who have experienced adversity are studied, it often takes this deficit approach, right? What can we do to help them, to bring them up, whether it's those living in poverty or in some condition of physical adversity. But I think looking to see how do they achieve meaning. Is it through helping others? Is it through personal growth? I think that's something really exciting that we can start to develop. And community ties may indeed be part of it, right? How does one mobilize community resources, whether it's in the case of a natural disaster, or even mobilize resources among incarcerated populations or refugees, and how they use their communities to help them collectively find purpose through assisting others, and then through kind of developing plans for their own personal growth.
Bonnie, if I could jump in, I really resonate with what Shige said, and he points to flourishing as sort of a dynamic nature. There's this growth, there's healing, and the meaning making that one brings to suffering or an adverse event, whether that's preformed in terms of a theology or whether it's something that one grapples with deep inside oneself. I think that's absolutely key to flourishing. And so I think whether that meaning is sort of as part of one's belief system, or whether one has to go deep to discover meaning through acts of service or reframing one's life, I see that as actually a really important part of flourishing. Thank you.
I think the Viktor Frankl is really exceptional. I mean, of course, he was in the concentration camp. He also saw other prisoners falter, lose hope, and physically get sick. So definitely, you some people are able to find meaning even in that, almost impossible situations. And sense making is really important for a psychological rich life as well. Just that the difference between the meaning and the psychological richness is that the meaning traditionally is construed as something like your life is adding up to something larger than your own individual lives. And there is a cohesion, and then you are part of this larger cosmos and so forth. And religion really is a great framework that help you to think that way. Unfortunately, there are other people who are not very religious, and those people do not necessarily feel the subjective sense of meaning or purpose per se. But from my observations, those not so religious people who still, from the difficult situations, sort of see the world in a positive way, I think they can say that they are, they found this experience as a learning opportunity. I learned something new about other people and myself. And that, to me, is sort of the psychologically rich life, not just the meaningful life. I mean, for some, that could be the meaningful life, like Viktor Frankl's and others. But for some, atheist artist, like the Hermann Hesse's Narcissus and Goldman, the Goldman figure, to me, it's probably better captured by another concept. So it is really interesting. In both ways, construal sense making is critical. And some people somehow have that really resilience. So I think it's important to look into why some people get to think this difficult situation in a different way. So, I mean, I don't know much about it yet, so I would like to explore that, definitely.
Thank you, Shige. It's very interesting to me that the three of you come from very rather different disciplinary backgrounds in the sciences. So by training, Debbie is a sociologist, David is a medical doctor and a public health professional, and Shiggy is a psychologist. And yet each of you will be working closely with people from outside of your disciplines in your projects. So in your view, how does a multidisciplinary approach add value to the study of human flourishing? And can you give me an example of how you work with people from outside of your discipline and what value that has added to your own work on how we explore, how we explore human flourishing in the context of significant challenges and adversity?
I could jump in. I'd say
okay.
just very quickly. There's not one discipline that owns human flourishing, and I think of it in the reverse. It's hard to imagine an inquiry into human flourishing from just one discipline. It just seems so limiting. I guess my experience in public health is that public health really depends on multidisciplinary inquiry, and we've really moved away from the biomedical model into a much richer understanding of what public health means, including flourishing. So to me, I guess I would just turn the question around, Bonnie, and just say it wouldn't make any sense to get flourishing from just one discipline.
That makes perfect sense. But, I grew up in psychology, and social psychologists in particular trained them to be social psychologists, and they're so proud of being able to do experiments and so forth. So we often hold sort of negative, bias toward other disciplines. So when I started out my work on psychologically rich life, I was like, well, is it really useful to talk to philosophers? Because I've read Aristotle, I've read those stuff, so I kind of know what it is. But it was really helpful because, so I worked with the philosopher Lorraine Besser at the beginning of this project of Psychological Rich Life. And psychologists are happy to just give one sentence definition of the concept and then move on to create the measures and collect data, and that's it. But Lorraine was like, no. You have to really say what is psychological rich life and what is not. And you have to give an example and a counter example and so forth. I was like, wow, that is really rigorous. So it is really helpful to work with philosophers. Obviously, philosophers are way, way, way better than social psychologists in conceptualizing, operationalizing. And of course, they know the background literature far better than us. So that was great. And now I'm collaborating with the developmental economist who work at the Asian Development Bank. So they already worked very closely with the farmers in Bangladesh, Sri Lanka. Also, they work with the really poor individuals in slum of Calcutta, slum of Manila, and so forth. And psychologists are so happy to just collect data from college students. And I, as a cultural psychologist, happy to just get college student data from India and Kenya. But these people are not happy with that. So it's really working with developmental economists, anthropologists. I really just appreciate that they bring in the real life, and no, college students are not enough to get the real information about the real world. So I became way more ambitious about data collection through collaboration with non-psychologists, essentially.
Yeah, absolutely. I think interdisciplinarity is so important to this question because at its base, we all have different conceptualizations of the why, right? Why do people do as they do? And so the psychologists often look for individual level explanations, whereas sociologists, we often look at social structures, for instance. So I think we're bringing very different lenses to this question. And I'm thinking on my team, we have an anthropologist who is in a school of theology, right? Who really is interested in specific dynamics that happen in particular communities. We have someone from the College of Fine Arts who looks at the role of the arts, right, in helping people living in adverse contexts, specifically incarceration, how arts may help people to flourish. A developmental psychologist who was always thinking about changing, right, that the capacity to flourish and understanding what flourishing is may actually change over time. So I think we bring these different lenses that are incredibly valuable, and we put them all together, we'll hopefully ideally come up with a richer conceptualization of what flourishing is. But as Shige mentioned, method also is a really important part of it. So our team has people who use very different approaches. So I'm a big survey researcher. So I look to see, can we look at statistical patterns in a large survey? Do the proportion who look like they're flourishing differ based on levels of income or levels of health? But that's very different than the approach that my anthropological colleagues will take when they'll identify one specific population, such as refugees, and dig deeply with probing questions about what are the experiences of this particular population. And if we do these kind of same probing questions across different kinds of communities and find similarities and differences in this rich qualitative data, that really helps to support what we find in surveys, which give us kind of breadth but not depth. So I think the methodological aspect that sometimes aligns with substantive discipline, as Shige mentioned, is something that also is a way that we can attack these questions from multiple perspectives and multiple theoretical lenses.
Thanks, Debbie. And I should note to all those who have joined us today that we will have a Q&A in just a little while. So please, if you have any questions that you'd like to ask our panelists, do use either the chat or the Q&A function in this meeting to share them with us, and we'll be definitely responding to them after another conversation that I'm going to now bring us into. So we've talked a little bit here about the concept of flourishing. You've shared a bit about your work with different populations in healthcare contexts and thinking about sort of theoretical frameworks for thinking about flourishing. I'd really be interested in hearing some of the reasons or the history and motivation behind your choice of research questions. So before our panelists go into that, just again a reminder for our audience to do share your questions with us. We'll have about 15 to 20 minutes of Q&A after this, towards the end of this. So, but yes, Debbie and David and Shige, what are some of the history of your own research sort of trajectories, but also motivations behind your interest in flourishing, in living well, what it means to live, what it means to have a life well lived? I'm going to call on somebody. Shige, please, if you don't mind starting.
Oh, sure. So my story is a little bit different. I guess I started out graduate student at graduate school back in '95 with Addiss and studying happiness. And, there were lots of questions that we didn't know, because back then, Dina was one of the few people who were studying happiness. And fast forward like 20 years, I vividly remember in the summer of 2015, it just hit me that, oh my gosh, I've been studying happiness for 20 years. What have we learned? And my answer was like, wow, we learned a lot, almost like we know everything about happiness. And we also know that, thought about what are the big questions? What have we been discussing? And it was at the time sort of the relative merit of eudaimonic well-being versus hedonic well-being. What's the role of happiness versus meaning in life? And we were so stuck with this question and dichotomous framework that it just one day occurred to me, like, why are we just thinking about happiness and the meaning, eudaimonic well-being versus hedonic well-being? Can you say that if you are happy and if you find your life to be meaningful? Is it the complete life? And maybe that this was my midlife crisis, but I wasn't sure. I thought my life is pretty satisfying and, meaningful. But I thought maybe something is missing too. So as I always do, when the semester started, the first lab meeting, I asked my graduate students and postdoc, what do you think? Is happiness and a meaning? I mean, if you have both, is it a complete life, full life? And half of them said, yeah, what else do you want? We know from happiness research, we shouldn't be greedy. We should be satisfied. Good enough is good enough. What are you talking about? But there were some others who are, yeah, if you look at the literature, like happiness and meaning, you have to be really disciplined. You have to work hard. You have to have the sense of purpose and dedications and so forth. And, some of us are not like that, unfortunately. Some of us like creativity. Some of us like more unscripted life. So we started thinking about those admirable lives that might not be characterized by happiness and meaning. I already mentioned Hermann Hesse's, Goldman, Narcissus and Goldman, but you might have read like Junot Diaz, The Brief but Wonderful Life of Oscar Wilde, sort of the traditional loser figure, but unbelievably rich, interesting life. And let's go on and on. I mean, you can go Kierkegaard's, either or James Joyce, young artists. I mean, some people really love and seek virtuous life, but other people seek some artistic life. And I think that life is not really well captured. So, as most of my research is, I was just wondering myself, what am I doing here with my life, and just involving graduate students and trying to get some idea, and then just started to think that, well, maybe this is a legitimate research question, and it is really shocking. When we just published a small paper about this, there were just so many people who ask questions and give us their life stories. So that's how I sort of started doing the psychological rich life research, perhaps as a result of the midlife crisis, partially, some dissatisfaction with the current state of the well-being research in psychological science. But yeah, so that's my story. Sorry, I just ramble, but that's what it is.
David, did you want to go? You look like you're on mute.
Oh, go ahead. That's fine. Yeah.
Yeah, it's kind of a great question, thinking about how what we've done informs what we're going to do. And I don't know if it's a midlife crisis or not. It's an interesting metaphor, but for most of my career, I've studied the psychological impact of major life events and transitions, So who copes well or less well with the death of a loved one? And how is it that the stigmatization that people with high body weight experience affects their mental health? And so much of this research has come out of the stress and coping tradition, right? And in my work and others' work, there's the assumption that those who possess coping resources, whether it's a positive outlook or a capacity to kind of minimize stress, those are the ones who can go on and be resilient psychologically, meaning that they attain high levels of psychological well-being, even in the face of major stressors. And a question that always nagged at me is kind of this: well, is it a luxury to have coping resources? Who are those people who have the privilege of thinking positively, or having the wherewithal to be able to restructure their social environment so that they can engage in problem-focused coping that mitigate against the problem, that helps them to thrive and to flourish? And so that's kind of the backdrop. And so I've been thinking for a long time, like, what about those people who have not had every luxury and every either economic support or emotional support that helps them to tackle problems head on, to be able to experience post-traumatic growth in the face of adversity? So that was a question I had lingering for a long time. And then when the call from Templeton came out and I got together with a group of BU researchers, we kind of all came to this collective understanding that this is a really big question. Is flourishing a right or a privilege, right? And what can be done to understand how flourishing is within the capacities of those who haven't had these resources? And are there things that we can do at the intervention level, at the structural change level, to ensure that flourishing is in fact something that all have the capacity to do? So long way of saying kind of my interest came out of this kind of stressing, coping, and resilience, and who can do well even when they face adversity, and really understanding, what are the contexts that allow people to have those skills, capacities, and supports.
Well, thank you. I have three sort of quick motivations that I'd like to mention. One actually was a crisis for me too. I was in the hospital a couple of years ago after a complicated surgery, and I got good care, but I didn't feel that anyone except a phlebotomist that would come in at 2 a.m. and draw my blood actually saw me and attended to my suffering. I don't know what it was about her efficient manner, but her presence, but I felt seen, and I felt that somehow my suffering was being addressed. And in those moments when she was taking my blood, retrospectively, I would say there was some element of flourishing that I experienced at that time. So what was that? What did she have that we need to sort of expand in the healthcare setting? What was it about me at that lonely hour of 2 a.m. That was receptive to receiving compassion or validation from her? So I was curious about flourishing in that particular setting. Secondly, there's a huge growing body of scientific evidence on the benefits of compassion in healthcare settings, not only for patients, but for family members, healthcare providers, and for health systems. And this comes from a rich interdisciplinary body of work. And so I'm very interested in linking that body of work to flourishing. And then third, the healthcare systems in our country and around the world are just collapsing under the weight of COVID-19. And we really urgently need to understand how to promote flourishing in the midst of that pressure on these systems.
Thanks, David. I think it's wonderful that you are all, bringing your own experiences to that, because it enriches your perspectives in the questions that you're asking and how you're approaching these. And I love the image, Shigehiro, of you working with your PhD students in your lab, just engaging with them and inviting them into these big questions about what it means to flourish, and it is what we're doing. Do we know, and should we stop at where we know now, and where can we push boundaries? We have a question from the audience. Are any of you, and the question is this, are any of you thinking about racism as an adverse experience, and whether and how people who experience racism can flourish in spite of it, or perhaps because of it? Would anybody, why don't you guys turn your mics on, all of your mics on, so that we can just kind of jump in and have a conversation around this?
Yeah, I'll say kind of absolutely. This was part of our conversations from the start. When we first started having these conversations, it was kind of post the summer of racial reckoning and the murders of Black men. And that was part of the backdrop that got us thinking, can you flourish in a world that is just unfair, with some people bearing the disproportionate burden? And we're trying to think, how can we study this? And so I think we're going to try to get at it and kind of, not to get too into the weeds, but kind of the survey part of our study. One of the surveys that we work with has explicit questions about racial discrimination in institutions, right? Kind of work, education, law enforcement, but then also microaggressions. Do people treat you as if you're frightening, if you're not as smart? And so that's one analysis we can do. In terms of doing our kind of qualitative explorations, it's not directly a part of it, but two of the populations that we are studying are either Black African or African American. And even though it's open-ended questions, we'll be really interested to see to what extent does racism play into the capacity to flourish, right? Or efforts that people engage in to overcome both systemic and interpersonal racism. So I think you're absolutely right. It's something that is always in the backdrop, and it may indeed impede some people's capacity to flourish. Yet there may be really novel ways of coping, whether it's religion, whether it is a greater sense of purpose towards social change. So I guess my answer is kind of yes and yes. And we're really eager to delve into this because it is just so important. And it's an area that hasn't always been fully brought to the fore, certainly in the positive psychology world. So thank you for that question.
Yeah, I agree that the racism is definitely adverse experiences. And the happiness research is really puzzling. I had the undergraduate honor thesis students who was African American, so she wanted to look at the African American happiness over time. So we analyzed the general social surveys data from 1972, and whereas white Americans, the poor white Americans' happiness went down almost year after year, African Americans' happiness didn't change so much. So we were really puzzled as to why. And of course, there's a social psychological literature where the African Americans who essentially blame, the racist majority for the racism, that this external attribution certainly help them deal with the tough situations. And so we started to think that, again, the happiness might not be the good metrics to look at this. So I think it's really important to examine this. Another previous findings that I really motivated my new research is this. When the Facebook just came about back in 2007, my graduate students was interested in who has African-American friends, minority friends, and who do not have friends. So UVA students, they agree us to look at the Facebook, their social network. So we called it the homogeneity of friendship network. And to our surprise or regret, really hope that the students who have diverse friendships would be happier, but that wasn't the case. That was complete opposite. Examine both end of it.
Thank you. This is such a great question, and it's so important for global health, where racism has been sort of at the base of some of the colonial legacies of global health. And I think if we're looking at impediments to flourishing, broadly defined, certainly racism has to be one of those really challenges to flourishing. And I think because of the prevalence of racism and the insidious nature of it, it's really crucial that we look at that carefully in the context of this relationship between adversity and flourishing. So.
Thank you. I have another question relating to the previous one. Are any of you in your work looking at how collective versus individual experiences of suffering and adversity influences an individual's capacity to flourish?
Yeah, we haven't looked at it, but essentially one major difference between, for instance, the natural disaster and some other, like victim of sexual assault or a crime, is that one, natural disaster tend to be more collective experiences, whereas the rest is very lonely individual experiences. And those individual experiences tend to have this rumination of why me? Whereas collective experience did not have this why me too, we are all together in this. So in general, I think that the collective, sort of the natural disaster, the collective experiences is easier to cope because you have this shared suffering, shared experiences, whereas the individual experiences, I think it's extra difficult to deal with. So definitely it is important to distinguish. And also there are many ways that the communities remember the earthquake, for instance. There are so many, the trees were planted, the local park was created after the earthquake and so forth. So in Kobe, for instance, if you walk around, even now, like you just encounter so many collective memory of the earthquake, then we survived, and we helped each other and so forth. And those, collective memories and monuments and so forth, how that help collective memory and collective, coping. So I think it is really important to look at that collective community level flourishing, as well as just individual flourishing.
One of our projects also will be looking at kind of individual versus collective, and actually maybe two. I mean, certainly the project focused on refugees who came over at a similar time period. This is a collective experience. But I think it is a really fascinating question. On one hand, the collective experience could bolster the capacity to flourishing, exactly as Shige said, because it's part of a community and a shared mission. But there's also an alternative hypothesis that I think we need to flesh out. All the members of the community have undergone a similar trauma, which means their capacity to flourish, their capacity to help and support one another maybe is undermined, right? Because for many of these people, they're facing a major adversity. So I think that will be a really interesting question. Are they able to build on one another, or are they all undermined in their capacity because of kind of the economic and social and dislocation adversity? So I think that will be another really fascinating component. And again, maybe it comes back to this theme of like subtypes of flourishing. There might be some ways where collectively they build meaning together, but other dimensions like happiness, which is something that has come up, maybe might not keep pace. So I think thinking about flourishing as a multidimensional, nuanced experience might actually be something exciting for us to explore and very productive for us to explore.
I think it circles back to the very first question I asked, which is about the current theoretical frameworks that are using to define flourishing, and also to think about what are sort of the boundaries of the definitional boundaries of the construct. And it sounds to me that in the case of each of your projects, you're pushing that definitional boundary by looking at more diverse populations and looking at people who are experiencing challenging and suffering and adversity. And in doing so, you will be pushing some of those definitional boundaries, which is very, very exciting to me. I have another question from Matthew Lee. So Paul Tillich, the theologian, argued that love is life in its actual unity, in which life overcomes its self-destructive forces. It seems relevant to flourishing as well, in that we flourish to the extent that we work together to contribute to overcome self-destructive forces in ourselves and the world and promote greater unity. What do you think of the relationship between this understanding of love and your own definition of flourishing? A positive affect might be part of this experience, but perhaps not always required. Love and flourishing, your thoughts on that, and especially a kind of more expansive definition of love. Love is more than just an emotion.
I could try to at least reflect on that a bit. My shorthand view of compassion is that it's what love does in the presence of suffering. So I really like this definition of love from Tillich, and thank you, Matt, for the question. It also resonates with the idea of wholeness, which I think very closely, in some ways, aligns with perhaps spiritual dimensions of flourishing. So I think it's highly relevant and very closely aligned, at least to the nature of the inquiry that we're trying to bring to bear in health systems.
Yeah, I love that question. And I don't have an answer right away, but it's so interesting. I think there are two components. One is kind of feeling loved, and then the other is giving love. And I think they could really help flourishing in different ways. So I'm thinking about being loved is linked to things like ontological security, right? That Giddens has written about, among others. And this feeling that if you're loved, it minimizes anxiety, it provides a sense of security that might help someone to grow and flourish. But then likewise, love, which is kind of giving outward, gives people a sense of some higher power or looking beyond oneself, right? And putting one's own needs perhaps either secondary or recognizing that there can be flourishing along multiple dimensions, the thing one does through one's own personal growth and advancement, but then also the things that one kind of does unto others through this process. So I think it's a great question that I haven't thought of until this moment, but thank you for raising that. I think it will really inform all of our work.
Thanks, Debbie. And I think there are different, thinking about love as more than emotion, but perhaps drawing on the resources of philosophy and theology, especially in thinking about spiritual dimensions, transcendent love, that, you know, I can see ways of that enriching the conversation as well. I have another question here from the audience. As you said, flourishing is diverse and dynamic, and different people in different life stages may have different definitions towards flourishing and well-being. As younger generations rely more on various social media platforms to get a sense of satisfaction and to connect with others, do you think the shift of technology that people use may also change the perception of what flourishing encompasses?
That's a great question. I think definitely the standard for a good life have changed dramatically. I mean, in ancient days, of course, you encounter 10, 15 people every day. You don't know anyone else entire your life. Now, if you're Instagram, Facebook, you see all other people's presumably edited, only the good part of their lives. So if you think that's what's happening for others, of course, we naturally compare ourselves with others. So I think we are blinded by and bombarded by unrealistic standards. Gene Twinger and others have documented this, that the younger generations are really suffering, and that suffering is in part due to this exposure to new technology and social media. So I think we can link it up to sort of the standards and conception of the flourishing, maybe just cultural, developmental variations, and cross-temporal historical changes as well.
Yeah, it's a great question. It gets me thinking, is there such a thing as kind of surface flourishing versus deep flourishing, right? Because one can put on this facade, right, that I am flourishing, everything in my life is going well, which might have some positive short-term impact, but at a deep level, right? Flourishing in either a more emotional or spiritual way isn't the kind of thing that you can portray with a selfie or an Instagram account. So it is interesting thinking about what one does and what one shows and how they align and how they compete. So it's, yeah, really good question.
There's an element of the social media that is addictive and actually consumes so much time that one one's not inclined to actually to reflect on some of those deeper levels. So there's some I think negative influences in staying at that surface level for most of our waking hours every day.
What we're coming up to the end of the hour, so I'm going to throw this final question at you and love to hear your thoughts on this. What boundaries in research in flourishing do you think need to be pushed? I mean, you've talked about each of your projects, and in different ways you are pushing the boundaries, definitional boundaries, methodological boundaries. What, in your view, what are some other ones that need to be pushed? What would you encourage researchers who are interested in human flourishing to be probing and asking?
Yeah, I don't know if this is boundary pushing, but listening to the voices of those who often have been excluded from standard research, and also thinking about actually kind of respecting boundaries, right? And maybe bringing in members of a research team who is a member of the community that's being studied, so that they feel empowered and they feel compelled that they can kind of share their lens, even if it might not necessarily align with the kind of lenses we have. So this is kind of a meta answer, but thinking about research as this kind of back and forth practice whereby we might go in with our clear questions, but allow some ground up impact on our research and allow the people that we're speaking to actually shape the research questions and methods in some way.
Thanks, Debbie.
I would say that perhaps down the road, once we have a clearer understanding of flourishing in these different settings and from different disciplines, is next. An understanding or conceptual understanding of flourishing may not be that useful unless we find ways to actually live that flourishing and create systems that allow people to flourish. So I think that would be one of the frontiers that I see coming towards us as we move forward together.
I think this is such a big question, difficult question, so I haven't really thought about it. But, Deborah mentioned that the role of art for prisoners. And I often think that the humanities as a disciplines are underutilized for the scientific study of flourishing. I mean, there are just so many great, amazing, literally examples of this, or even, PBS, This American Life type, life stories of ordinary peoples. And we could definitely push the boundary and sort of start collecting the story bank and create the story bank of the human flourishing from all over the world. And if you can just collect them and share with them, I think people will be interested in. And also, we get the exemplar of a flourishing life, not just from Instagrams and the Facebook, but the lived, life. So that might be one thing I would like to see.
Thank you. As a parent of a preteen and two smaller children, I was really that the question about technology and flourishing has sort of captured my imagination, especially when we know that we are not spending any less time on these things. That the future is not any less of this, and so I'm personally really interested and hoping to see more research on the role of technology in relation to our flourishing as well. I have a last question from the audience, and I think this will be a fun one too. Given the different ways that Eastern and Western cultures conceptualize human flourishing, do you see a way to find common ground and or a way to bridge these conversations?
I inherently think that the focus is very different. At least the Buddhist tradition I come from is really the basic assumption is life is suffering. So detachment to all the material possessions and so forth is the key to sort of the happiness. But the happiness we're thinking about is the calm, quiet feeling. We're not thinking about sort of the fulfilling one's own unique potentials or anything grand. It's really just trying to deal with the difficulties and so forth. So I think there are a lot of cultural traditions and difference in how we think about human flourishing. And what I'm hoping by doing and shedding light on the cultural variation in these is not so much trying to find the universal view, but rather to share there are diverse ways to be really flourished. One vision of flourishing is like Olympian, amazing. But the other version is really just trying to deal with the everyday problems and just, try to live as calm and ethically and then virtuously as possible. So I really love this panel, and everybody is interested in sort of the non-traditional samples and the cultures and so forth. And I think it's extremely important and enlightening to bring this diversity in the perspectives of different ways we can thrive and flourish.
Yeah, I would just add real quickly, we're not really digging into this in our particular project, but it's a fascinating question in this era of globalization. Are we seeing a convergence between Eastern and Western? And to come back to the theme of tech that we just talked about, for younger cohorts coming through who have a global view of what they see on Facebook and Instagram, is that going to lead to some kind of, I don't know, melding of the notions somehow? I don't know. I think it's $1 million question, and I'd be curious to see again what the data show a few years down the road.
Absolutely.
And I would just add, I think there's probably some real lessons about flourishing from the non-Western cultures that we could use to enrich our own flourishing. So I think I'm less interested in an amalgam, but more interested in the forgotten lessons or perspectives that all of us may need. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, David, Debbie, and Shige for sharing your projects and your ideas with us. As I wrap up this webinar, I just wanted to let the audience know that our final webinar in the series will take place on October 22nd at 12 p.m. Eastern Time. And the topic will be community-level truth-seeking to promote human flourishing. This webinar will feature projects by Dr. Michael Muthakrishna from the London School of Economics and Dr. Jocelyn Dottel from Queen's University in Belfast. And the webinar will be hosted by Dr. Dawood Pakija, who's Director of Programs and Discovery at TWCF, and we hope to see you there. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Thank you, panelists, and I